Right, okay, well, let's start. So if I can say a very warm welcome to all of you here we go. A very warm welcome to all of you for attending today. And this is our 9th CIG Services Masterclass. So greetings to those of you who are joining at times well outside the normal working day. And I know some of you are from overseas, and thank you for making the time. I'm Amanda Bucklow. I'm a commercial mediator, and as part of the CIG Services Group, I specialise in accelerated dispute resolution and project negotiation and mediation. And I'm your host for this morning's masterclass. Today's masterclass is scheduled to last 50 minutes. After the main conversation, our guests will answer questions for 20 minutes. So if you do have a question for our guests, please put it into the chat and I'll gather those together for the questions session after the presentation. And as a matter of housekeeping, please let us know in the chat if you don't want your name included in any attendance list. And the meeting is being recorded, but your names don't appear on the recorded version. They're only visible when you're in the presentation. At the end of the presentation, I'll launch a poll, which is basically to ask you, how did we do? When we have completed the session, you will receive an email with the link for the extended presentation, which Nigel has prepared, and the video. But if there are any urgent requests for the slides, please put those in the chat as well. CIG Services is a group of innovative and experienced construction professionals and from many disciplines. We rapidly evaluate construction, operational and financial performance to meet project or investment objectives, or indeed to support turnaround. Over the last 2 years, CIG Services has offered insights and proposed actions to support the construction industry, both in the UK and globally. And in May, we initiated and were signatories to a letter published in the Times. And our theme of improved governance in the industry is explored further in today's masterclass from the point of view of non-executive directors. Our speakers will share their insights on the role of NEDs in construction and what the benefits are of getting the right people in the right place at the right time. Our first speaker, main speaker, is Nigel Brindley. Nigel has been a non-executive director for various project companies and construction businesses for over 20 years and has been appointed by investors, lending banks and commercial sponsors. He specialises in financial and operational performance improvement and advised a private equity firm in the acquisition of a distressed construction companies in the aftermath of the Caribbean collapse. Nigel led the asset management and investor reporting at Barclays Private Equities Infrastructure Funds, and previously at the investment division of Molam before its acquisition by Carillion. Nigel's early career was in design and construction with Arup and Molam, where he worked on high-profile projects such as the iconic Lloyd's building in London, BP's Oil's new HQ, and the MI5's Thames House refurbishment. And our second presenter today is Joanna Martin. Joanna has been in executive search for 16 years, building on her experience of leading a series of support services businesses, ranging from construction and education to utilities and waste management, and including private equity-backed companies. Andy Matthews, well, Andy is head of Infracapital's Greenfield Infrastructure Investment, and he has over 30 years infrastructure finance and investment experience. And his previous experience was in construction at John Lang and Alfred McAlpine. And Andy joins us by telephone today due to firewall issues with connection with Zoom. So welcome to all of you. Nigel.
Thank you for that lengthy introduction, Amanda. I'll try and live up to it. I'll put on the share screen, yes? Which, assuming I can find the slide. Right, so my presentation today is really on the non-executive director roles and whether they build better boards or not. And in particular, my background, not that I'm going to bore you with this, but it's been for a variety of different companies, a mix of commercial, investor and banks, and most recently, in particular, Lloyd's and Santon Capital of the state. Santon is a distressed asset fund. So what am I going to cover? Well, briefly, I'm going to cover the background to the non-executive role and touch on the difference between an NED and an independent director. But what I really want to get to is the relevance of an NED appointment to construction SMEs and project companies, infrastructure SPVs and the like. I will then hand over to Andy to give an investor perspective on the appointment of NEDs and ask Joanna to touch on the challenges of getting the appointment right. So what is the background to the NED role? Well, this really all stems from the Cadbury Committee report in 1992, which was a response to the corporate scandals and failures of the 1980s. It led to the UK Corporate Governance Code, compliance with which is a listing requirement if you are a PLC on the London stock market. The objectives were to bring independent judgment and objectivity to the business of company boards and provide a balance to dominant personalities that may be on those boards, as well as protecting the rights of shareholders and other stakeholders. It's not law, but it is best practice, and the Financial Reporting Council asks companies to comply or explain in their annual reports whether they comply with the governance code. Listed PLCs have a minimum of 3 NEDs or 50% of the board, and increasingly across the UK industrial sector, SMEs have 1 to 2 NEDs, and they are being increasingly adopted by smaller companies to show that they are following best practice. So what does an NED do? The purpose of an NED is to provide independent judgment, objectivity, and outside experience. In essence, to provide a broad perspective to the board decisions and to challenge and support in equal part the executive team. I think the point to raise here is that the legal requirement or the legal obligations of an NED are no different to an executive director. So they're very much part of the team. So the challenge and support part is really from the inside, and it is better, I guess, that that kind of contribution is made rather than a board making the wrong decision and then being challenged more publicly afterwards, which can obviously undermine the company's credibility and confidence in what it's doing. The other aspect of an NED appointment is to consider the interests of other stakeholders, be they shareholders, clients, employees, the public, and the like. I did say I was going to talk briefly about the NED versus the independent director and what is the difference. Not all NEDs are independent, and there is nothing wrong in that. For example, a shareholder may be entitled to nominate a director in a non-executive capacity on a board. There's also what I would describe as pseudo-independent NEDs, mates of the chairman, or a director swap with a partner organization. So there are two types of NEDs. There are those that are appointed by organizations that have a vested interest. And as I said, there's nothing wrong with that. It's just that their interests and agenda will be slightly different to those of a purely independent NED. So what are the pros and cons of appointing an independent NED? I think this slide probably sums it up quite well. So I've touched on the advantages, the constructive challenge and the management oversight and accountability that an NED will bring. They're there to oversee the financial and operational performance and ensure the interests of other stakeholders are covered, but also to provide a sounding board for strategic direction and key business decisions, and to serve as an intermediary for shareholders, clients, other stakeholders, and potentially people that may have a dispute with the company in order to sort of defray that. There are, of course, downsides to the appointment of an NED. There's the cost of recruitment itself, which can be very considerable. There's the cost of the appointment. And there is then the difficulty in defining the precise needs of the business. Do they need a long-term NED, somebody to work with them over the long term? Typically, an NED appointment on that basis is 3 to 5 years, because businesses evolve and therefore the requirement of the NED will evolve over that period. Or it can be a much shorter term appointment, maybe to meet a specific challenge or business initiative. And of course, the difficulty of finding the right NED is often an impediment to recruiting. They must fit with the business needs and the personalities and be appropriate for the business's stage of development. So finding an NED is not without its problems. So considering there are difficulties in finding an NED or finding the right NED, is it relevant to smaller construction companies? You can carry on as you are. The magic may just happen. But let's look at it in a bit more detail. As well as providing the wider benefits I touched on earlier, an NED can be selected to contribute to specific experience to meet particular challenges. And those challenges can be issues such as a management buyout, business expansion, acquisition or dispute or refinancing. In other words, issues that are one-off issues that do not form part of the day-to-day operation of a company, and therefore where the company may benefit from additional outside expertise. And because the NED is only part-time, the company buys in that skill and experience at what would be an unaffordable price or an unaffordable cost if the appointment was a full-time role. Other benefits of appointing an NED may include the NED's network connections, its experience of dealing with advisors and the advisors that they know. And of course, they can raise investor and or lender confidence, which may be important to the company in the context of applying for new loans or raising new share capital. This is because the appointment of an NED provides evidence of transparency and good governance. The construction industry is often characterized as having a combative culture. So it's not surprising to find dominant board personalities on the boards of small companies. And the balance that an NED can bring there can help to balance and enable others at a board meeting to speak out, and also to help overcome the challenges of groupthink. Just looking at the focus of the NED versus the executive team, it's not really surprising that executive boards tend to be preoccupied with the immediate operational challenges, the here and now, if you like. Construction is a cash flow business, so cash flow, invoicing and payments are bound to be preoccupations. And expanding a business post-COVID can create working capital challenges. So there are a number of immediate challenges that are always going to be there. And in the current environment, these are on top of the much publicized labour and skill shortages facing the industry, rising supply and raw material costs, and the like. So why is the NED focus different? Well, I think the point here is that the immediate, or the decisions that are being made to deal with immediate challenges by a board can be looked at in the longer term perspective. An NED will be interested in, if you like, future-proofing those decisions and ensuring that they don't compromise the long-term prospects for the company, as well as looking at issues such as sustainability, succession planning, management resilience, and of course, governance and compliance. So let's look at the relevance of an NED to an SPC or a project company. There's a similar balance, if you like, to that I've just described for smaller construction companies. So typically, the executive team focus will be on contractor performance, the operation of the concessions payment mechanism, which leads to revenue risk, penalty avoidance, and increasingly in a number of SPC areas or project finance areas, dispute management. Investor reporting tends to be retrospective, perhaps too much so. And day-to-day client relationship management is also becoming increasingly important, particularly where public sector clients are becoming more assertive. So there's a lot to exercise the executive team, and how does the NED focus sort of vary from that? Well, the NED focus will be looking at the future operational and financial threats that face the concession. That can be the adequacy of life cycle budgeting or the opportunity of refinancing. And increasingly critical is the concession expiry and handback risks. These concessions are now reaching the latter halves of their periods. I think it was when I looked recently that there are something like 300 PFI concessions that are expiring between now and 2030. So handback and concession expiry risks are coming to the fore. Also, the NED will need to be considering lender relationships and support. Typically, concessions are very highly geared, maybe 90%. Therefore, although lending terms are on the basis of low risk, if equity gets blown out, suddenly the lenders are facing a very much higher risk than perhaps originally assumed. And of course, having touched on investor risk, Maintaining shareholder returns and confidence is equally important. If there is only a 10% equity slice, then clearly it wouldn't take too much to go wrong to blow the equity value. Acting as an intermediary in client and contractor disputes is also an important aspect where NEDs can add value, and they will of course be mindful of high-level concession relationships with the clients, users, the public, etc. So I was really talking to that slide, so I'm sorry that, that I was on the wrong slide there, but I'll just leave that there for a second. So do NED costs outweigh the benefits? Of course, companies will be concerned about the time and affordability concerns of appointing an NED. Typically, an NED is appointed for 2 or 3 days a month for smaller companies, and typically at a cost of 25 to 40,000 a year, depending on the needs and experience of that NED. But the financial benefit can often outweigh the costs. I know of a case study where the NED helped to restructure a company over 3 years, adding 5 million to the shareholder value, and that represents a return of 50 times on the cost of the appointment. So yes, an NED can provide financial value if the appointment is appropriate to the challenge or the need of the company, there's a good fit with the business and the executive team, the strength of character of the NED is truly independent and impartial, and the NED has the necessary stature and credibility to carry the support and confidence of the board and other stakeholders. So, if an NED is to be appointed, how do you go about it? As I perhaps alluded to a little bit earlier, it's not a job for the boys or an executive swap. Full value is dependent on finding a truly independent appointment. And this requires a detailed skills gap and needs assessment. And the company needs to do this in order to define a detailed brief, because getting the requirements properly defined is the key to finding the right person to meet those needs. And then how to actually locate the NED. There's open advertising and/or specialist external search consultancy. These are common routes to finding an independent NED. But there are risks of getting it wrong. The wrong appointment can create internal conflict within the board. It can distract rather than contribute to board challenges. The complexity and infrequency of appointing an NED can put pressure on the recruitment process. And because of that complexity and the fact that it is not something that occurs in the normal day-to-day business, there's the temptation to always defer it, push it back. It's a problem for another day. If independent, it's quite likely that the NED will not be known to the board. So you need to establish faith and trust in the appointment. And therefore, rigorous candidate due diligence is important to ensure that those skills and experience and personality fit with the business's requirements. So, why appoint an NED? I won't repeat L'Oreal's strapline to that. But what I will do, looking at my stopwatch, that's 19 minutes and 45 seconds, so that's exactly on time. Andy, perhaps I can ask you to come in and just give your perspective for 5 minutes or so from the investor viewpoint. Andy, is there a knock knock that you can do?
I'm trying.
I think you might be on mute.
Yes, ask him to unmute. I've muted you, Andy, so you need to unmute.
Well, maybe while Andy's unmuting, perhaps shall we turn to Joanna to just talk us through the challenges of finding the right guy?
Yeah.
Or guy-ess.
Yes.
Okay. Hi, everybody.
Sorry, Joanna, do you want me to put your slide up?
Yes, that would be very kind of you. Thank you.
Okay.
Just while Nigel's sorting that out, so I've spent 9 years in executive search, and I now am a partner in a company called Stork & May, which is, if you'd like to think of it as reverse search. So amongst other things, we help people land non-executive director roles. I work predominantly across the industrial sector, and typically we work with people from large companies who are leaving those organisations and going into smaller companies. So from your perspective, if you are involved in a project where you are looking for a non-exec director to bring very extensive experience to you, then we're always worth a call, particularly because we're free. So I really just highlighted a couple of bullet points. The first is Nigel's made the point of, what skills and experience, contribution, etc. do you want? And I can't emphasize enough that in order to get the right person when you decide to go and look for a non-exec director, you need, as your board, you major shareholder or whatever combination thereof, you really need to work out what your specification is. I've seen more searches go wrong because the board can't agree between itself what it wants than the headhunter not actually delivering. And nobody will end up happy if you start off with one specification, look at a few candidates and realise that's not really what you wanted, you change it, and you say to the headhunter, will you go back out again? You'll get hacked off because it's too slow, and the headhunter will get hacked off because they're putting a lot of resource into something that you haven't thought through. Similarly, if you happen to be on the candidate side, which I imagine some of you might be, you don't want to go through a series of interviews and then be told, oh, well, we were looking for something different. My second bullet point is just to give you a feel for how much non-exec directors are paid. Mostly these days, they are put onto a payroll in the larger companies, not exclusively, but a straightforward board member with no additional responsibilities in a medium-sized company would probably be paid, small to medium, 25 to 40k, which is the figure Nigel gave you. In larger organisations, it can easily be 100k, and if you take on additional responsibilities, then it could be more than that. If the need of the company is flexible or is likely to vary, then quite often there's an element of day rate for some specific project work. In terms of how to find a non-exec director, or indeed how to insert yourself into the process if it's your aspiration to become one, executive search is the traditional route. Generally, they are not cheap because of the amount, frankly, the amount of work you do for a small company search versus a large company search is pretty much similar. And it really boils down to finding the right search firm with the right connections and a consultant who is hungry. It looks all very grand if you're a small company going to Corn Ferry, but if they're doing a board search for Shell and you're turning over 100 million, I'm afraid you are going to come second best. There are increasing ways of advertising for roles online, particularly new role for those that haven't seen it yet, go and have a look. They are very cost effective and they're actually very good. The main papers have an online service which is not cheap. And Women on Boards is a great site. If it's not exclusively women, it's a groupage site, but again, you can log searches on there. And similarly, even if you're a fella, you can join Women on Boards. I think it's about £100 a year and see what searches are around. Great site. The other alternative is contract research. If you particularly want some very specialist skills, then find a contract researcher, and I'll tell you how to do that in a second, and tell them to map the market, and then you will get what you want. LinkedIn is great. You can advertise free, or you can put yourself up for hire for free. It will give you a lot of applicants, which would need sorting. And if you're a candidate, you'll see a lot of roles which you won't be interested in. But it's a good way of finding out how the market feels. And finally, your advisors, both incoming and outgoing, they will give you good advice, but they love appointing or advising, introducing candidates to boards because they figure they've saved the company some money, and therefore they're due favours. With all of this, if you've got any questions, by all means, come and give me a shout, and I will do my bestest to answer them. That's me. Over to Andy.
Thank you, Joanna. Thank you. Andy.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you, yes. So I was saying a few minutes ago that I'd like you to give us the investor view on NEDs, value and appointment. So if you can give us a few minutes on that, would be appreciated.
Yeah, thank you very much, and apologies everybody for IT failure on my end. So let's get straight to it. So yeah, I'm Andy Matthews and I'm head of InfraCapital's Greenfield business. And to give you all context, we manage around £3 billion of equity invested in various businesses that are building or constructing new infrastructure. So we have investments from Poland to Portugal, from the UK to southern Italy. So very wide ranging. We're only 11 people. And we're building things from fiber telephone networks to waste energy plants to electric vehicle charging infrastructure to thermal batteries. So a huge geographical scope and a huge sectorial scope as well. So for a team of limited resources in terms of people, independent directors and NEDs are very much part of our business and an essential part of our business as well. And really just sort of, if you can see the slide that Nigel's produced for me, really, for me, it's a sort of three main areas, really. They give independence to the business. We're very focused on our clients, whereas we raise money from pension funds in the private market, and we're looking to invest that in various assets. And we use the independent NED model really to add sort of resources to our team. It's an additionality resource that can dedicate time to individual companies. So we are effectively sort of generalists in a way. We have broad backgrounds in investment and making investment return. But what we like to do is bring an independent director around the board table that can dedicate time. That person may have sectorial advice and specialisms, as Nigel talked about, in terms of bringing something to the board. Often our companies are quite new because they're building new infrastructure. So they are quite early in their evolution as a business. So it allows us to bring some grey hair around the table that you probably couldn't attract. So we've got ex-CEOs who might be of large utility companies or large telephone companies who wouldn't want a full-time job in a small developing company, but is willing to dedicate some time, a day a week, 2 days a month, to really try and help developing and evolving management teams in bringing their business forward. So therefore, whilst you can't hire them directly, as Nigel says, you can sort of get for this part-time advice. And we find that's really, really important in the skill gap that we have in the management teams. And some of our investments, start at 10 million, and in 10 years' time, that could be 300 or 400 million of equity. And the management team will change in the evolution of that business. And the NED director can often give us continuity allows us to bring in skills that we can't naturally attract to be the executive management on a full-time basis. Business obviously too small, or often, the quality of the NEDs we attract, often many of them are sort of part-time retired or looking for a plural business, which is where they have many different sort of NED roles. They often have very deep contact books in the sector they're specialising in, and we found that very helpful. We have a rail business at the moment, where we've seen significant review of the rail industry, and he's been very useful just to be able to bridge the gap between the DfT, the government, and the actual industry itself. So filling that gap in is very important for us. And the management teams really do like the fact that we support this model. And Nigel spoke between independence of appointment or appointed by us as a shareholder. We are the majority shareholder in everything we invest in, and we have rights to appoint non-exec directors. But equally, we're quite happy to work with management team to appoint, a completely independent director as well. And that helps sometimes to sit on things like remuneration committees and also to sit on audit committees and audit commissions and things like that as well. So that independence helps as well for my final point really to make is bridging that gap between the investor, so the supplier of the capital, that's ourselves, and the management team. And it gives the management team a sounding board. If I think about this business plan, they can have a chat to the NEG offline. They often go and meet the management teams on a regular basis out of cycle of the board meeting to do extra work. And they're often a part of that business planning cycle before I see that as the investor, and sort of often comes to see me and say the management team about doing this acquisition or building this extra piece of infrastructure. And they help to bring about that sort of the two different teams. I'm looking at return on capital, I'm looking at dividends, I'm looking at growth, I'm looking at long-term value. And hopefully the independent director can help to bridge the gap between the short-termism that Nigel talked about, thinking about the day-to-day problems that are in the business, which are forefront of the executive management, as well as thinking about long-term investor return. And our fund has the ability to hold the assets almost indefinitely. So I know that we'll see businesses grow, we'll see management teams grow. We've got to look at succession planning. We've got to look at all that sort of human resource well-being, certainly post-COVID now in terms of distress and recapitalising businesses. And it's a really, really important part. I think underplay just how important that is to our business. So every board that we sit on, we have either an appointed executive director or a independent non-exec round the table. And it is essential to business, and it's a real value add part to your businesses. That's probably my 5 minutes, Nigel, but I'm very happy to take any questions.
Thank you. Over to you, Amanda, I think.
Okay. Well, thank you, all of you, very much for your contributions. And I would really appreciate if anybody had any questions. I've got a couple here that I can kick off with, but if anybody has a question, hands up. Yes, Richard Bayfield.
I'd be interested in the model as it applies to some of our major projects, because I can see that the structures or strictures of the stock exchange and so on mandates requirements for non-execs, and that's a sound business model. But where are the non-execs on Crossrail and HS2, for example? Comments welcome.
Quite happy to say first response. But certainly we work in the private market, so not in the listed market. So one of our mandate is not to invest in the listed world, and we very much, we're the majority shareholder in. We invest in projects and we invest in companies, and we do see that it improves governance, it improves transparency, it adds independence around the board, and I certainly advocate it in any sort of asset that you can separate executive management from shareholding and have independence around the table for challenge both ways, vertically, horizontally, upwards into shareholder groups. Are the shareholders behaving themselves? Downward into executive management. So I'm a real advocate in any asset class in the non-listed market as well. So yeah, very much like to see those real focus, but it takes a lot of work. You've seen the accountability we've seen in projects like Crossrail. You need to give the non-execs access to information and the scope to do their job properly.
I think there's also a parallel here with project boards, because where you have independent representation on project boards, i.e. the boards that run projects as opposed to companies, and things like HS2, of course, will have a very large project board. The value of bringing independence to that is that it's still, the benefits of an NED still overcome those traits around groupthink, dominant personalities, etc. So although I've spoken about NEDs in a sort of company environment, there are parallels with large project boards for significant companies. And a number of private or a number of, if you like, sponsors of projects use that approach. I said earlier that, or Amanda said earlier, that I used to work at Arabs. In large project design, we used to have what we call peer review sessions, where we would actually regularly have to present to people outside the project, people outside our group in Arabs, why we're doing certain things in order to bring that challenge. And again, it's, if you like, it's internal. So you can be as challenging as you like, but it's much better that it's challenged internally than you fall into the trap of believing your own design and then finding you've got a problem later down the path. People like Serco, I know, do what they call RegCap reviews, which is another similar sort of independent type review on what's happening within a project. So there are parallels here in terms of the project environment.
So could I just add to that? The large organisations, the large projects like Crossrail have the same sort of corporate governance as the listed environment. So they go to the large search firms to appoint independent NEDs.
Okay, thank you. Does anybody else have a question to put to any of our speakers before I field mine, or what I have in front of me? No. Well, Joanna, I've got a question for you here that's been sent to me privately, not in the main chat. What are the, in your experience, what are the myths around being an NED that actually you have to work quite hard either way, either with the client or the potential NED, to sort of re-educate?
If I would say with the client or the hiring company, be demanding. So a lot of chief execs sort of say, well, I don't really get much out of my NEDs, and a lot of NEDs say, I don't hear much from the chief exec. On average, most NEDs spend about 30 days a year with a company, but hey, there's always a little answer called no. So the myth from the company would be keep asking until somebody says no. From the individuals, I think a lot of people don't think about how to use their skills to the benefit, skills and experience, to the benefit of the company when they're applying for roles. So, I've been an executive director at Shell, therefore I should be able to walk into a non-exec role. Actually, that's not generally straightforward. I always give them the example of I can't remember what the razor is now, that has 72 blades or something stupid. Who cares how many blades the damn thing's got? But you want a close shave. So people think just because I've done this, I can walk into non-exec roles. Not the case. You've got to think about what you bring to the party.
And in terms of what you bring to the party, are you seeing a shift in the sort of skills matrix that is sort of coming up? Or
we're seeing clients being a lot broader in their thinking, and obviously things like the diversity agenda, which is much broader than just women and ethnic minorities. It's a diversity of thought. And again, when I was in search, I would frequently say, particularly in the contracting construction sector, go look outside the sector for your non-execs. Go and ask a shopper about how to build shopping centres. There is a lot of chairs don't like off-the-wall challenge because they don't know how to handle it. Whereas actually, we all know that our 3-year-old child can ask the best questions. So people are opening their minds now to diversity, which I think is the biggest and most important and most valuable change that we see. But funnily enough, the post-COVID, the world's changed as well in 2 ways. One is searches are much quicker, which is great, and because everybody can get to a final offer stage electronically rather than having to trek into London or whatever. And the other is the quality of board is actually improving, because let's say you're a water company based in Bristol or I don't know where Penn are based, but down the southwest. Most people don't want to trek down to Bristol once a month, whereas now companies are holding, say, 50% of their board meetings remotely. So the pool that they draw on in terms of quality has become larger.
Yes, okay, thank you. Anybody prompted with a question so far?
Well, I will just add something to what Joanna's just said, because there is this sort of catch-22, which when appointing an NED, people want people that have already got experience as an NED. And that is because, the very point that Joanna made, is because being an executive director and being a non-executive director are very, very different skill sets. So if you want to be an NED, you've got the catch-22 that to be an NED, you need to, well, to become an NED, you need to be an NED. But there are ways around that. There are, for example, becoming an NED on a charity, because charities very often it's a pro bono work. So you become an NED and you can get the experience of an NED there. That's one route in, for example.
And so question for you, Nigel, and I've got one for you as well, Auntie. But question for you, Nigel, what surprised you most on your first appointment as an NED?
I suppose reticence. The company hadn't had an NED before, and therefore didn't really know what it was about. Felt as if they were having their homework marked, which, if you like, is a reaction that is counter to the very role that an NED is meant to bring, which is openness and transparency. So one of the biggest challenges was establishing trust and getting people to understand that we're all part of the same team. And on one of the others, it was an American fund actually that had just done an acquisition, and there the US just didn't understand what an NED was about. They said, we don't use NEDs in the States, they're just not required. So it's quite a different culture. So those were two particular aspects.
And it's anybody else who has been an NED? Richard, is that something you've done? Have you been an NED?
Not yet, no.
But does anybody else want to add something to, what are the surprises? Where are the gaps in the education? Is there a shift?
I would, if I may, please, Amanda.
Sure.
I've been on both project boards and as an NED, And one of the things I think is quite noticeable with medium-sized construction companies, I think Nigel said this earlier, they're generally led by pretty strong characters. And whilst they might appoint you, they don't necessarily like to hear what you have to say. They don't like being questioned. And I think this is quite a problem. It makes you think your appointment is for appearances rather than for effectiveness.
I think that's a good point. And I think, as Nigel said earlier as well, it's about trying to get people to realise the importance of the role. And I think that's, as we as a shareholder manage to get across, is that the management, do need to see the NED as adding value. And I think some of the misappointments I've seen is where that message hasn't got across, and we haven't got everybody in the same zone to think about what value does the individual bring. And that is a sort of a virtuous circle in terms of once we get to understand the value, then they start to use them. But you're absolutely right. We've seen some very strong management teams sort of almost reject the insertion of an NED, and you do really have to get that buy-in. And that starts with stepping back from the board and saying, right, what are we trying to achieve together between executives and shareholders? That's a really important first phase. And I think, as Joanna said, you've got to get the mandate right. You've got to get the specification right. Otherwise, it's a fight, and it's not a success, and that's not what anybody wants.
I think establishing trust with, say, the CEO is the most important thing to start with.
Yeah, exactly.
There is some great thought leadership. If you go onto the Corn Ferry website and the Corn Ferry Institute, there is some super thought leadership around, both sides, what makes a good NED, and what some of the challenges are. And I'll admit that what makes a good NED, the original work was done, I was involved, so it was done in like 2000 or maybe earlier than that, I can't remember now. And it's still, they've updated it since, but it's still true. And the worst thing you can possibly say is, when I was an executive, I did ... because that'll just turn everyone off to you.
Amanda, if I could chip in here. I'm currently a non-exec chairman of a medium-sized developer and contractor down in Essex. And before I joined them, I was interviewed by the two particular partners that own the business. And I discussed with them what they wanted, but I made it quite clear that my style was challenging. And if they thought bringing me on board would just to have bounce a few ideas off me, was the wrong approach. And I think that point Charles made about trust, I think if you're a non-exec and you set out your stall and explain which way the way you try to operate, it's not one size fits all. But if you give them an idea, it doesn't come as a shock the first time you're sitting in the boardroom and you start to ask why. What are you doing that for? Where's the benefit for the shareholders in this? And they've sort of taken that on board. Having said that, I acknowledge what others have said. They're trying to get them to do everything that you discuss and agree in the boardroom. They don't always follow through because they've been so used to being independent and doing their own thing.
Chris, do you think that's, or anybody, Andy and Joanna and Nigel, do you think this trust issue links with the fact that a lot of these positions can go to close associates and people that people know well?
Well, I'm not a close associate of either of them, although I have to say that one of them was my trainee way back. But that was a long while ago. There's many years passed under the bridge since then, along with a lot of water. Yeah, I'm not linked to either of them, and I made it plain that it was, if you want me on board, you're going to have to rely on the approach that I take.
And how's it going?
Yeah, we have good days and bad days, I have to say. The very last day out, the two of them got in a bit of a slanging match, and I just had to stop them. I just said, that's the end of this. This is serving no useful purpose, not the best use of our time. So we stop now, or we call a halt to the whole process that we're doing today. But having said that, I've managed to get them to divest their businesses into a development business and a construction business, where it was all mixed up before. And I was trying to get them to gauge or actually view what their end purpose was, what their end goal was, and where do they end up with this business, and what do they see happening here. And we've split the businesses up so it becomes more sellable when the time comes.
Yeah, I mean, I'd just add to that. One of the things that I have seen is that when the NED goes on board, everybody on those board meetings is on their best behaviour, and if they haven't bought into the process, in other words, if it's been put in because it's part of the terms of an acquisition that is an NED put on the board or something like that, then you have this tendency in some cases where the big decision making is actually carried out at one level down at the executive ExCo, the executive committee level. And therefore, you get a filtered view of what's happening in the business fed up to the board. And that can be a real problem, because as an NED, you're there trying to represent or consider the interests of all stakeholders, but you're not getting all the information.
And so how does that that relationship development, how does that affect the approach? And maybe this is one for you, Andy. The long-term appointment versus the short-term appointment. If you've got a kind of a challenge, as Nigel expressed in his presentation, you've got to challenge a particular issue that needs addressing, and maybe it needs specialist input for a period. How easy is that to sell? And from an investor point of view, would you go as far as imposing it as a requirement?
I think having specialist advice, which may be short term, through a dispute, through a litigation, through troubling times or defending a takeover. Yes, we've looked at short term recruits, which is very, very specialist advice, and sometimes almost appointed for that advice, versus the long term continuity that other appointments get. I mean, we've been lucky in sort of my sort of investment sort of history that we've never got to a point of having to make the appointment as a shareholder vote. We obviously structure our position as being majority such that we can get that through. But I like to do it such that we get to a position where everyone around the table sees the benefits. And I think as a number of people have said, they'll always see that. The CEO may not see that. The CEO may see, well, I've got all the experience I need for my business. I don't need this individual. And we've had to rework some ideas or make them fit in, change the scope slightly to make sure it works without compromising governance, because governance, as we all know in the world of ESG, is very important. We get the G right in governance. And as Nigel just suggested, we don't want decisions being made at the wrong level in the company. But it is a bit of a negotiation sometimes, and to answer your question, is getting that person in. I say I'm fortunate enough that I haven't had to put it to a shareholder vote, but that's one of the reasons for having a majority position in most of what we do, is perhaps the management understand that and know that we've got to find a compromise, if that's what we call it, to get the right skills around the table. But yeah, we've definitely looked at specialist advice for short-term roles, which may or may not conflict with long-term goals whilst you sort the short-term problem out.
We frequently coach.
Never easy.
we frequently coach both chief execs and non-exec directors on how to do their roles properly. We tend to work with larger companies, so corporate governance tends to be something they've grown up with a little bit more. But usually the tension is with the chair of REM.
Yeah.
Andy, have you ever put somebody in post that has proved to be incompetent?
I certainly have seen that. I've seen aspirations of people who come to me with good CVs. We've agreed with the manager that this person looks right, feels right, sounds right, and then we found out that what they really thought this job was about was turning up a board meeting, saying a few things, and clipping the coupon on the fees. And we have had to remove people to say the job is more than that. It's everything that Nigel's listed out in his presentation. This is a real job. This is a real value to be added to the business, and it isn't just about turning up a few board meetings and asking a few questions. It needs commitment, and it needs to share your skills and be willing to be engaged and listen as well as tell. So,
yeah, interesting you say that. I was on the receiving end of a venture capitalist appointment, the business I was involved in, and it was a job for the boys. It was a pal of one of them who came in. It was supposed to be a turnaround specialist, and it was a fatal blow, really.
Yeah, you've got to be really careful. You get yourself a bad name as an investor as well.
Yeah.
So you've got to be careful, because people that gets around the industry very quickly, and that rails against you, making the investment in the first place. Other shareholders will start to object to you. So
yeah,
you have to act quick. You have to act quickly, and really
when the VC's got a casting vote, your objections fall on stony ground.
Yeah, exactly. But that'll be the last deal you do.
Yeah.
Okay, is there anybody else? Because we've got 3 wonderful experts here who are ready to answer your questions. Does anybody? Oh, Arshad, you've got your question hand up.
It's probably less of a question, but just adding to the earlier comments made. I've been a portfolio non-exec director for about a decade or so. Predominantly in the construction, EPC and manufacturing markets. Something that I've seen a trend in is non-institutional owners taking on board non-exec directors, predominantly high net worth families that have a significant business, and they're looking for some guidance. It's often come from 2 directions, in my view: either a little bit of self-awareness that we do need some external view, external support, or it's been foisted upon them based upon poor performance. Blood is certainly thicker than water, I found, and owner managers around a board are often quite difficult. And I first bit that challenge back in 2009-10 in geographies where there was still the lag from the financial crisis, predominantly in Ireland, Greece and Portugal, where I was appointed by a number of sort of medium-sized businesses. I just wondered whether anybody else has seen that trend as well, where you've got family-owned businesses. They're typically around the sort of 100 to 250 million revenue. So not huge, but sort of large, small businesses. I found that quite a challenge, and there has to be buy-in somewhere within that shareholding that we need an outside-in view. It's often treated with suspicion. There's a trust issue if you haven't got the same surname. But I just wondered, and I've successfully managed to navigate that. I just wondered whether anybody else has had that experience, because it is a slightly different dynamic.
So we've seen quite a lot of family business, and certainly sort of quite a lot of family businesses appointing non-exec directors, but they've, and particularly in the construction sector, they've done it through, they operate into the business through family councils. So if you look at an NG Bailey or an OCS or Shepherd Group, they all have very active and generally well-chaired financial councils, and they have quite clear governance on what roles family members can play. But I imagine, I can't remember, NG Bailey would be on like 7th generation now, I guess. So they've had time to evolve that. But they do provide quite helpful role models for second, third generation family businesses. still not easy.
No, it's not.
No.
It's quite difficult. I think in 5 businesses that I've been involved with that have a family dynamic to them, 3 of those, the advice together with not just my own but others, was a staged exit, because there were so many inter-family debates and concerns going on. There was one element that saw the business as a cash cow for the family. There were businesses that had quite philanthropic approach, but there were some mature businesses, particularly those that were supported by Harvard and Dublin universities on high net worth families, the generational succession plan, where it was felt that there's definitely needs to be recognition that there are better people out there that can deliver the same results or better results for you. So I've certainly seen that trend of letting go, and a number of these businesses have been acquired by institutional investors that see a great, pedigree, but it can be taken to the next level.
Yeah, to add to that, I was approached a few years ago by a fund that was owned by really no more than, I think, probably 2 family offices. And they had, for them, what was a very big investment in a renewable energy project, which was going badly wrong. And this renewable energy project was being run by this particular company that they had invested in. And they weren't happy with it, and they weren't happy with the performance and their exposure. So we went through a series of meetings on this, and guess what? Because the company wasn't performing, and you had a very strong personality as its CEO, they rejected the investors' idea of putting in an NED. Completely rejected it. And the investors were so scared of this dominant personality, they gave in, and that is exactly the same kind of thing that you're talking about, Az.
Yeah, I think the slide bullet that you had, Nigel, around larger than life personalities is certainly labeled to the construction sector. We've all, it's a rough, gruff, traditional background. It is evolving. I think it's moved into a very different place, certainly than when I started out 30 years or so ago. I think that there's trust. I think credibility often helps as well, that you've been there over, you've had a sort of parallel experience as well, and you just need to counter those equally loud voices, I suppose. But if people aren't willing to listen, they're not going to listen. I often find that mix of institutional investor, owner, manager, investor, it's often the institutional voice that helps make the right decision in this, that an outside-in view is the logical thing to do. If it stands up there, it stands up anywhere.
Thank you. I am aware that we have, as usual, run out the time, and want to be very respectful of your time. So unless there's any other question, I'm just looking around the screen or comment. I'd just like to wrap up and invite you to give your comments on what has happened today. Tell us if there's anything that you'd like to explore further. The video will be on the website, as I said, and we'll also, Nigel has also said he's willing to share the more extensive slides, which will also be on the website. So unless there's anything else, I'd just like to thank Joanna. Thank you very much for your input and for your presentation today. Andy, thank you for struggling with the tech issues. Thank you very much.
Thank you for putting up with me. Thank you, everybody.
And Nigel, thank you very much for all the effort and preparation that you put into giving us a very important overview. My colleagues Richard and Charles are here, and I'd like to thank them. And that brings us to the end. So I wish you a very good day, and we'll see you next time. The next masterclass is on the 23rd of July. We have invited Ruth Backley, who is ex-CEO of 2 very different local authorities. And she's going to talk about what it's like to deal with local authorities on major infrastructure and other construction projects. So that is likely to be a very interesting talk. So we will be sending out an email to you to let you book up for that one. That's Ruth Backley, and that's on working with local authorities on infrastructure and construction projects.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Bye-bye to all of you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Enjoy discussions. Bye-bye.